I'm glad you're here. There's no rush right now. You don't need to be anywhere else, and you don't need to bring anything with you into this moment. Just take a breath. However your day has been, it can stay outside for a bit. I'm speaking slowly on purpose, not because there's something heavy coming right away, but because I know how rare it is to sit with words that aren't trying to pull you somewhere. This isn't a place where you need to respond, agree, or even feel anything in particular. You can just listen. Or you can let the sound sit in the background while you notice your own thoughts. I don't know what kind of week you've had. Maybe it was full, maybe it was quiet in a way that felt a little too empty. Maybe you've been carrying things that don't have clear names anymore. Have you noticed that feeling when something stays with you, but you're not sure when it started? Or when you've done everything you knew how to do, and still feel tired in a way sleep doesn't fix? You don't have to answer any of that. I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm just checking in. Sometimes being asked, gently, is enough. I want you to know this isn't about fixing anything. It's not about learning a lesson or coming to a conclusion. I'm not here to guide you toward a better version of yourself. I'm just here to sit in one small stretch of time and talk about something that once happened the way it actually felt from the inside. If at any point you drift, that's fine. If something I say feels familiar, you don't need to hold on to it. And if nothing connects at all, that's okay too. For now, just stay with the sound of my voice. I'm here, and I'm going to tell you about something that stayed with me longer than I expected. At that time, my life looked full from the outside. There was movement, responsibility, and a constant sense that something always needed attention. I was married. There were children. There was a shared home, shared routines, shared decisions that didn't feel optional. Every day carried weight, even the ordinary ones. I don't want to go into private details. That's not important here. What matters is the structure of it. A marriage that had lasted long enough to build habits, long enough to build expectations, long enough that walking away didn't feel like an option you could even name out loud. When you have children together, time stops being just yours. Every choice stretches wider, every disagreement feels heavier, because it doesn't end with two people. It reaches into schedules, futures, and quiet moments you don't control anymore. I remember how much effort went into keeping things moving. Conversations that started calm and ended unresolved. Decisions made quickly because there wasn't time to sit with them. You tell yourself this is normal. This is what adult life looks like. You assume closeness will return once the pressure eases, once this phase passes, once you solve the next problem. But the pressure didn't ease. It stacked. Responsibilities didn't replace connection, but they slowly stood in front of it. There were days when we functioned well, as a system, but not always as partners. And that difference is subtle at first, easy to ignore, easy to justify. I was investing time, energy, attention, not perfectly, but consistently. And from the inside, it felt like effort should count for something. You show up, you stay, you keep choosing the same life every morning. That has to mean something. At least, that's what I believed. What made it harder was not knowing when things started to slip. There wasn't a single moment you could point to and say, this is where it changed. It felt more like waking up one day and realizing the distance had already formed. Not wide enough to panic yet, but far enough that you noticed the quiet. We were still sharing space, still sharing responsibility, still connected on paper and in practice, but something underneath was loosening. And I didn't understand why. I didn't understand how you could work so hard at something and still feel it thinning in your hands. There's a particular kind of tension that comes from that place. When you're trying to hold something together without being sure what's pulling it apart, you don't know whether to push harder or step back. You don't know which direction makes things worse. So, you do both. You hold on tighter while feeling it slip anyway. At the same time, life doesn't pause. Children still need attention. Decisions still need to be made. The world keeps asking things from you. So you keep functioning. You keep the structure intact, even when the meaning inside it feels unstable. I remember thinking, more than once, that maybe this was just what long relationships turn into. That closeness changes shape. That comfort replaces intensity. That distance is the price of continuity. Those thoughts weren't dramatic. They were practical. They helped me get through the day. But there was also the growing sense that something wasn't aligning anymore. Not breaking yet, just pulling, quietly, constantly. If you've ever been in a place where everything looks committed, but feels uncertain, you might recognize that state, where you're still inside the relationship, still responsible for it, but already sensing that you're farther along a path than you realized. Not past the point of return, maybe, but close enough that turning around would take more than effort. That was the context. No big declarations, no clear endings, just a long stretch of time where things were still happening, still connected, still intact, and yet not steady in the way they once were. During that period, what I remember most clearly is how tired I was. Not the kind of tired that comes from long days or lack of sleep, but a deeper one. A tiredness that followed me even when things were quiet. Even when nothing was happening, I felt worn down, like something inside me was constantly bracing. I was trying. That part is important to say, not as a defense, but as a fact. I was showing up to conversations, even when I didn't know what to say anymore. I was listening, even when the words started to blur together. I kept telling myself that effort mattered, that if I stayed present long enough, something would shift. But day after day, it felt like the effort went in and disappeared without leaving a mark. There was a steady sense of guilt that came with that. Seeing someone else hurt, knowing that you're part of the situation, even if you don't fully understand how. It's a quiet kind of guilt. Not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, reminding you that no matter what you do next, someone is already carrying pain. I questioned myself constantly, not in a sharp way, but in a slow, wearing one. Am I missing something obvious? Am I not listening the right way? Am I too rigid or not consistent enough? Those questions didn't come with answers. They just repeated. And the repetition was exhausting. The hardest part was the conversations. Not the arguments, but the talking that went nowhere. You start a sentence already knowing how it will end. You recognize the pattern before it finishes unfolding. And still, you keep going, because stopping feels like giving up, and giving up feels worse than being tired. There were moments when I felt completely unsure of my footing. Like the ground I was standing on had shifted slightly, just enough that I couldn't relax. I didn't feel in control, but I also didn't feel like I could let go. That in-between state drained more energy than I expected. I remember feeling small at times. Not insignificant, but reduced. Like the version of myself in those moments had less range, fewer options. I wasn't thinking about the future. I wasn't thinking about endings. I was just trying to get through the next interaction without making things worse. And there was a kind of loneliness in that. Being close to someone, sharing space and responsibility, and still feeling separate. It's a strange thing, realizing that closeness doesn't always protect you from isolation. Sometimes it sharpens it. I didn't see myself as a victim, and I didn't see anyone else that way either. What I felt was a steady confusion mixed with fatigue, a sense that I was reaching the limits of what I knew how to do, without knowing what those limits meant. If you've ever been in a place where you're still trying, still present, but quietly doubting whether your effort is enough, you might recognize that feeling. The one where you're not dramatic about it, you don't collapse. You just keep going, even as something inside you feels thinner each day. That was what it felt like from the inside. No clarity, no distance, just the weight of continuing and the uncertainty of whether continuing was helping or simply delaying something you didn't yet have the strength to face. At some point, without a clear moment or decision, something inside me began to settle, not resolve, just settle. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped pulling so sharply in opposite directions. I noticed that the thought I kept returning to, maybe if I try a little harder, was starting to wear thin. Not because I had stopped caring, but because repeating it no longer brought energy with it. It felt automatic, almost mechanical, like something I said out of habit rather than belief. There was a quiet recognition forming. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't even fully accept it right away. But it was there, in the background. Not everything responds to more effort. Some situations don't bend, no matter how carefully you apply pressure. That realization didn't feel dramatic. It wasn't a relief. It was closer to fatigue, giving way to clarity, but only slightly. I wasn't letting go. I was just no longer pushing in the same way. I started to notice my own limits more clearly. Not limits imposed by time or circumstance, but by capacity. How much attention I could give before I felt hollow. How many conversations I could have before the words lost meaning. There was no anger in that noticing, just observation. The need to control the outcome softened, not because I trusted what would happen, but because I could see that control had already slipped beyond reach. I hadn't lost it suddenly. It had been drifting away for a while. I was just late in recognizing it. That shift changed how I showed up. I was still present, still responsible, but less combative with reality. I stopped rehearsing alternate versions of the same conversations in my head. I stopped measuring each interaction against what I hoped it might fix. There was a kind of quiet acceptance beginning to form. Not acceptance of an ending, and not acceptance of failure. Just acceptance of uncertainty, of not knowing how this would turn out, and acknowledging that knowing might never arrive in the way I wanted. I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel wiser. I felt steadier, in a limited way, less pulled apart by the need to solve something that wasn't responding to solutions. The inner noise lowered a notch, enough that I could hear myself think without immediately trying to correct the thought, enough that I could pause instead of reacting. It wasn't a turning point. It didn't change the situation, but it changed how much energy I was spending fighting what I couldn't fully influence. And in that small adjustment, the constant strain eased just enough to keep going without the illusion that effort alone would determine the outcome. That was the shift. Quiet, incomplete, and very real, in the moment it happened. Looking back now, with some distance between me and those years, the first thing that stands out is how ordinary it all was. Not the pain itself, but the way it unfolded. There were no sharp lines separating effort from failure, or love from distance. Just a long process of trying, adjusting, missing things, and sometimes misunderstanding what was actually being asked of me. I can see more clearly now that there were things I didn't do well. Not in a dramatic sense, and not because I didn't care. Sometimes I stayed focused on what needed to function instead of what needed to be felt. Sometimes I assumed that consistency would speak for itself. Other times, I believed that providing stability was the same as being emotionally available. Those weren't malicious choices, but they had consequences. At the same time, I don't erase the effort that was there. I showed up in the ways I knew how at the time. I stayed longer than was comfortable. I kept trying to repair what felt strained. Those attempts weren't imaginary. They were real, even if they didn't lead where I hoped they would. Holding both of those truths at once took time. It's tempting to simplify the past to turn it into a clear mistake or a clear injustice. But real relationships rarely fit into clean stories. Most of the time, they end not because one person failed entirely, but because two people reached the edges of what they could give each other. When I look back, I don't see a lesson neatly packaged inside the pain. There isn't a single insight that explains everything or redeems it. Some experiences don't resolve that way. They don't leave you wiser in a way you can easily point to. They just leave you changed, quieter in certain places, more careful in others. I've learned to be honest about that. Not every difficult experience exists to teach something useful. Some of them simply mark a boundary of capacity, timing, or compatibility that wasn't visible before. And trying to force meaning onto those moments can feel like another kind of pressure. There was also grief that didn't announce itself loudly. Grief for the version of life I thought would continue. Grief for routines that once felt stable. Grief for the idea that effort would always be enough. None of that came with clear closure. It faded gradually, unevenly. What helps now is allowing the past to be incomplete. Allowing myself to say, this mattered, and it hurt, and it didn't resolve into something clean. I don't need to defend myself against it, and I don't need to condemn myself because of it either. When I think about relationships that ended, I don't reduce them to failure anymore. I see them as stretches of time where people did what they could with what they understood then. Sometimes, that understanding grows too late to change the outcome. That doesn't make it meaningless, and it doesn't make it heroic. If you've ever looked back at something important in your life and felt pressure to explain it, to justify why it ended, or to extract something positive from it, you're not alone in that instinct. We're often told that growth has to look productive, but some endings don't offer that kind of clarity. There's a quieter way of holding the past, one where you let it remain complex, where you acknowledge the harm without exaggerating it, and acknowledge the effort without inflating it, where you don't ask the experience to prove your worth or your failure. That perspective didn't come all at once for me. It formed slowly, as urgency faded, as time passed without the need to defend any particular version of events. What remains now is a steadier understanding. I was present. I made mistakes. I tried. Things still ended. And that combination, uncomfortable as it is, feels closer to the truth than any simpler story I could tell. From where I am now, with some space between myself and those years, there are a few things I can say without pushing them onto anyone else. They aren't conclusions, and they're not instructions. They're just observations that stayed with me after everything settled. One of them is this: a relationship ending doesn't tell the full story of who you are. It can feel that way for a long time. When something important falls apart, it has a way of spreading outward, touching your sense of identity, your memory, even how you look at your past choices. But I've learned that one outcome, no matter how painful, doesn't have the authority to define an entire person. I used to believe that effort should guarantee a result, that if you show up consistently, stay engaged, and keep trying, things will eventually turn, and sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. That doesn't mean the effort was empty. It just means effort isn't always the deciding factor. There were things I did that didn't change the ending, conversations I stayed in, compromises I tried to make, time I gave without knowing if it would help. None of that reversed what happened. But looking back, I don't see those moments as wasted. They mattered because they were real attempts, made honestly, without holding back. Their value wasn't erased just because the outcome didn't change. Another thing that became clearer over time is how quickly we turn inward when something breaks. We ask ourselves what we should have been more of: more patient, more understanding, more flexible. Those questions come naturally, especially when you care. But not every ending exists because someone wasn't enough. Some situations unravel because timing shifts, because needs change, because two people grow in directions that no longer meet, even if neither of them is wrong. That can be hard to accept, especially if you're someone who believes in responsibility and follow-through. But responsibility doesn't always mean control. If you're carrying questions like that, quiet ones you haven't fully formed yet, you don't need to rush them toward answers. You don't need to decide what it all meant or what it says about you. It's okay to let those questions exist without solving them. I've found that giving myself permission not to summarize the experience helped more than trying to explain it. Letting it be what it was. Letting it take up the space it naturally occupies, without forcing it to justify itself. You may be in a place where you're wondering whether what you gave was seen, or whether it counted. I can't answer that for you. What I can say is that effort doesn't lose its reality just because it didn't lead to the future you imagined. And a relationship ending doesn't cancel the years you showed up inside it. There's no requirement to come away from something like that feeling stronger, clearer, or more resolved. Sometimes, the most honest outcome is neutrality, a quieter understanding that things happened, you were part of them, and now they're over. If any of this connects, you can hold on to it in whatever way feels right, or you can let it pass. There's no expectation here. These are just reflections from one person who's been in that uncertain space, offering them without asking anything back. Whatever meaning you take from your own experience is yours to decide, in your own time or not at all. Before we end, I just want to say thank you for staying with me through this. I know listening to a story like this isn't always easy. It can touch places we don't usually open, especially when it resembles parts of our own lives. If anything stirred quietly while you were listening, that's understandable. And if nothing did, that's just as okay. I'm aware that what I shared comes close to private ground. Not just mine, but yours too. Experiences like these tend to overlap in ways we don't plan. They remind us of moments we've lived through, or are still carrying in small, unfinished ways. There's no need to sort any of that out right now. You don't have to take anything from this with you, unless you want to. There's no message to remember, no feeling you're supposed to hold on to. This was just a stretch of time where one experience was spoken out loud, calmly, without asking for a response. As we come to a close, you can return to whatever comes next in your day at your own pace. There's nothing more you need to stay for, nothing else waiting to be explained or resolved here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving this moment your attention, in whatever way you did. We can leave it here,